Chapter 7, Part 1. Mother, he screamed, and he could not be sure if the scream awakened him or the pain in his stomach. His whole abdomen was torn with great rolling jolts of pain that doubled him in the darkness of the little shelter, put him over and face down in the sand to moan again and again, "Mother, mother, mother." Never anything like this, never. It was as if all the berries, all the pits had exploded in the center of him, ripped and tore at him. He crawled out the doorway and was sick in the sand, then crawled still further away and was sick again, vomiting and with terrible diarrhea for over an hour. For over a year, he thought, that's what it felt like. Then he crawled back into the shelter and fell into the sand. He could not sleep at first and do nothing but lie there. Awake for a second, perhaps two. He did not know where he was. He was still asleep somewhere. Then he saw the sun streaming in the open doorway of the shelter and heard the close, vicious whine of the mosquitoes he knew. He brushed his face, completely welted now with 2 days of bites, completely covered with lumps and bites. The smell was awful and he couldn't place it. Then he saw the pile of berries at the back of the shelter and remembered the night and being sick. Too many of them, he said aloud. Too many gut cherries. He crawled out of the shelter and found where he messed the sand. He used sticks and cleaned as best as he could. It was still very early, only just past dawn, and the water was calm. He could see his reflection. It frightened him. The face was cut and bleeding, swollen and lumpy. His hair was all matted, and on his forehead a cut that healed but left the hair stuck with blood and scabs. His eyes were slits from the bites, and he was somehow covered with dirt. He slapped the water with his hand to destroy the mirror. Ugly, he thought, very, very ugly. And he was, at that moment, almost overcome with self-pity. He was dirty, starving, bitten, and hurt, lonely, ugly, afraid, and so completely miserable that it was like being in the pit of a deep, dark pit with no way out. He sat back on the bank and fought, crying, then let it come, and cried for perhaps 3 or 4 minutes, long tears of self-pity, wasted tears. He stood, went back to the water, and took small drinks. As soon as the cold water hit his stomach, he felt the hunger pains sharpen, as it had before, and he stood and held his abdomen until the hunger cramps receded. He had to eat. He was weak again with hunger. Back at the shelter, the berries lay in a pile where he had dumped them when he grabbed the windbreaker. Gut cherries, he called them in his mind now. And he thought of eating some of them, not such a crazy amount as he had, which he felt brought on the sickness the night before, but just a few to starve off the hunger pains. He crawled into the shelter. Some flies were on the berries, and he brushed them off. He selected only the berries that were ripe, not the light red ones, but the berries that were dark, maroon red, black, swollen with ripeness. When he had a small handful of them, he went back down to the lake and washed them in water. Small fish scattered away when he splashed the water, and he wished he had a fishing line and hook. Then he ate them carefully, spitting out the pits this time. They were tart, but they had a slight sweetness to them, although it seemed to make his lips a bit numb. When he finished, he was still hungry, but the edge was gone and his legs didn't feel weak as they had before. He went back to the shelter. It took him half an hour to go through the rest of the berries and sort them, putting all the fully ripe ones in a pile on some leaves and rest in another pile. When he was done, he covered the 2 piles with grass he tore from the lake shore to keep the flies off and went back outside. They were awful berries, those gut cherries, he thought, but there was food there, food of some kind, and he could eat a bit more later tonight if he had to. For now he had a full day ahead of him. He looked at the sky through the trees and saw that while there were clouds, they were scattered a bit and did not seem to hold the rain. There was a light breeze that seemed to keep the mosquitoes down. And he thought, looking up along the lake shore, if there was one kind of berry, there should be other kinds of berries, sweeter kinds. If he kept the lake in sight, as he had done yesterday, it should be all right. He should be able to find home again. And it stopped him. He had actually thought it that time. Home. 3 days. No, 2 days. Or was it 3? Yes, this was the 3rd day, and he had thought of the shelter as his home. He turned and looked at it, studied the crude work. The bush made a fair wall, not weather-tight, but it cut most of the wind off. He hadn't done so badly at that. Maybe it wasn't much, but also maybe it was all he had for a home. All right, he thought, I'll call it home for now. He turned back and set off up the lake. heading for the gut cherry bushes, his windbreaker in his hand. Things were bad, he thought, but maybe not that bad. Maybe he could find some better berries. When he came to the gut cherry bushes, he paused. The branches were empty of birds, but still had many berries, and some of those had not been merely red yesterday. They were now a dark maroon black, much riper. He decided to pick those ones. But the explosion in the night was still much in his memory, and he decided to go on. Gut cherries were food, but tricky to eat. He needed something better, much better. Another 100 yards up the shore, there was a place where the wind had torn another path. These must have been fierce winds, he thought, to tear places up like this, and they had a path he had found with the plane when the plane had crashed. Here, the trees were not all the way up and down, but twisted and snapped off halfway from the ground, so their tops were down and rotting and gone, leaving the snags poking in the sky like rotten teeth. It made for tons of dead and dry wood, and he wished once more he could get a fire going. It also made a kind of clearing. With tops of the trees gone, the sun could get down to the ground, and it was filled with small thorny bushes that were covered with berries. Raspberries? He thought. These he knew because there were some raspberry bushes in the park that he and Terry were always picking and eating them when they biked past. The berries were full and ripe, and he tasted one to find it sweet, and with none of the problems of the gut cherries. Although they did not grow in clusters, there were many of them, and they were easy to pick. Brian smiled and started eating. Sweet juice, he thought. Oh, they were so sweet and juicy with a tiny tang in his mouth. And he picked and ate and thought he had never tasted anything so good. Soon, as before, his stomach was full, but now he had some sense and he did not gorge or cram more down. Instead, he picked more, put them in his windbreaker, feeling the morning sun on his back, thinking he was rich with food now. And he heard a noise to his rear, a slight noise, and he turned around and saw... And I'm going to stop there for part 1 of chapter 7. Stay tuned for tomorrow, chapter 2 of part 7. Bye. What do you think he saw?